Welcome to the Red Dice Diaries RPG podcast with John and Hannah.
Hi.
We're going to be looking at another monster from the AD&D 2nd edition Monstrous Manual as part of our Friend or Foe Friday. And we're going to be comparing that to 5th edition, if possible, maybe having a look at a few other books, and giving a few ideas as to how you could maybe spice up your use of this monster in your game. Okay, so let's have a quick dice roll to see what letter we're going to be looking at. Okay, it's 21.
That's a U.
And how many monsters are there with the letter U?
6. And we've already done one of them.
Okay, so let's roll a d6 then. 2.
That is Undead Death Tyrant. Beholder.
Oh, yeah, that's the Beholder variant. Yeah, I remember that. Okay, so, flick to page 21 and we'll see what's in there. Yeah.
And Beholderkin.
Yeah, obviously we all know the basics of Beholders from D&D and the famous computer game, of course. Big floating aberrations, these huge sort of eyeballs and mouths with loads of little tentacles coming off them, or eye stalks if you prefer, each of which has an eye at the end and can normally dole out some magical rays and such like from the various different eyeballs. So we're looking at the Death Tyrant specifically, which is it on that page or is it on the second page?
Ooh, there's actually 3 or 4 pages about
there's
Beholders.
loads of Beholderkin. There's like
Death Tyrant.
Okay, so what does it say about the Death Tyrant in the AD&D 2nd Ed Monster Manual, love?
It says that they're rotting, mould-encrusted beholders.
Ugh.
Yeah, pretty much what you'd expect an undead beholder to look like. Milky film covering their eyes. That's a nice detail.
Yeah, so that makes sense, because you see that in fish, don't you, when they've been dead for a long time.
Undead beholder can use all the powers of its surviving eyes, just as it did in life. The powers of 2 to 5 of those eyes, which are selected randomly, are lost due to injuries or death.
Well, that's a nice touch.
Charm powers are lost during undead.
Mm-hmm.
And eyes that charmed can either have a weaker hold monster effect,
or they're just useless.
Yeah, just useless. They're immune to sleep, charm and hold spells.
Does it say anything about whether they have like any sort of volition of their own, or are they literally just like mindless, like undead that have been raised by somebody?
It says, if not controlled by another creature through magic, hangs motionless until its creator's instructions are fulfilled.
So it is a mindless undead then?
It would appear to be so.
Okay.
In most cases, they're created through the magic of evil beings, from humans to illithid villains.
So give me the old mind flayers in there.
And some outcast magic-using beholders have been known to create them.
Oh yeah, because I vaguely remember there's a thing where like the beholder's like centralised, like the normal beholder. It's like an anti-magic cone, but there was some sort of magey variant that sort of deliberately like put out like its central eye or something, so it could focus like magery through some of the other eye stalks and replace them with spells. I vaguely remember that from like the 2nd ed, but they were like outcasts because studying magery, which I was quite like, because beholders were always portrayed as like madly xenophobic, and it was supposed to be like the reason there's not like loads of beholders like everywhere is because any beholder that perceives even a minor difference in like coloration or different number of eye stalks or even slight differences in size would turn on other beholders, because they believed that their form was obviously the true beholder form and that anything else should be wiped out.
Like the Daleks.
Yeah, pretty much, yeah. Big floaty nutsack eyeball ray shooting Daleks.
Yeah, the Daleks even look a bit like them in the Eccleston series, don't they?
Yeah. Alright, okay, so that's it in the AD&D 2nd edition Monster Manual. Let's have a look, see what it says in the 5th edition Monster Manual.
Have we got as many different kinds of beholders? I suspect not, because I was looking at page 5 on the other book. Beholders, including the Death Tyrant.
Boom. What's it say in the 5th edition Monster book then?
Well, do you want to read this one?
Yeah, can do. Okay, so it says here, I mean, as you were saying, love, the sort of genesis of them in the AD&D 2nd Ed Monster Manual was pretty straightforward. Magician of some type raises dead beholder, creates undead, boom, done. Nice and simple. And you'll find that with a lot of the undead in the second edition, AD&D, and sort of before that, it's like evil wizard has cast a raise dead spell on X creature. This is what happens. However, as we've said before in a number of monster sort of episodes, 5th edition often pushes a more sort of like mythic explanation for them. So this is what we get for the Death Tyrant. On rare occasions, a beholder's sleeping mind drifts to places beyond its normal madness, imagining a reality in which it exists beyond death. When such dreams take hold, a beholder can transform, its flesh sloughing away to leave a Death Tyrant behind. A Death Tyrant appears as a massive naked skull with pinpoints of red light gleaming in its hollow eye socket. With its eye stalks rotted away, 10 spectral eyes hover above the creature and gaze in all directions.
So it looks very different then.
Yeah, it almost sounds more like a lich rather than your mindless zombie / skeleton, which is what
that one sounds a lot more zombie, and this
and
one
it's
a lot more.
In here, it's casting them in the roles of like these deathly despots, where they pretty much like use their abilities to have hordes of undead servants. So they're very much casting them in the sort of evil, undead, villainous mastermind sort of role in here. They even have an ability called Armies of the Dead, where a Death Tyrant embracing undeath becomes an engine of destruction. Blah 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 blah. It says, if left unchecked, a Death Tyrant might wipe out the population of a city in weeks, then set its undead eye on wider conquest. As each settlement falls, the Death Tyrant's zombie forces build to overwhelming numbers. So I'm just going to see what it has in terms of ability. Oh yeah, there we go. So instead of a negative magic cone, they get a negative energy cone from the central eye, which basically, if you hit anything that's dead in it or you kill stuff in it, it's a zombie under your control. So yeah, they're really casting them as sort of like the ultimate undead villains. And whereas in AD&D Second Ed, it was like, oh, they're sort of rotting, they're falling to pieces, some of their eye stalks don't really work properly, etc. In this, they've got like floating spectral eye sockets, they're a bit ghostly, a bit sort of undead, like say, a bit more like the Lich, the sort of archetypal leader of the undead. Yeah, so that's pretty interesting.
Again, I've got to say I prefer the Second Ed artwork.
I don't know. I mean, I've got to say here, I really do quite like that artwork. And obviously you guys can't see this, but to give you some idea, the Death Tyrant in the AD&D Second Ed Monster Manual just looks like this shriveled, withered sort of carcass with some limp eye stalks hanging down and this milky white central eye. Whereas in the 5th edition Monster Manual, it's this entirely skull-like. It has this burning red glow in its central eye socket and these pinpoints of red light, which are the spectral eyes floating around it. And I've got to admit, this is probably one, I can see why you like that one, but this is probably one of the few cases in which I prefer the 5th edition artwork. I mean, normally, yeah, the older artwork all day, every day, but for this, especially, well, I think to be fair, it depends what they're going to be used for, because I think the AD&D artwork is certainly more appropriate for a zombie-like minion. However, in 5th edition, they've upgraded it to like a lich-like overlord, and the artwork in 5th edition is certainly more appropriate for that. Okay, so I think the issue we're going to face, as with some very specific monsters, as we've said before, is there's probably not a lot of mythology connected with beholders, I'm going to guess, because I think they're pretty much a D&D thing.
No idea where it came from.
Okay, so according to the Wikipedia page on beholders, which I'll put a link to in the show notes, the beholder is among the Dungeons & Dragons monsters that have appeared in every edition of the game since 1975. They're one of the few classic Dungeons & Dragons monsters that Wizards of the Coast claim as product identity, and as such was not released under the open game license. So it's obviously a monster that's been invented specifically for D&D. Okay, so we get a little more in the Wikipedia entry. It confirms that it's an aberration, as we said earlier, which are these strange sort of twisted beings, often that come from different spheres of existence, and they are extremely xenophobic, as we touched on earlier. Every beholder believes that their exact body template and structure is the platonic ideal of the beholder form, and even the slightest variation of that can lead to genocidal purges trying to destroy these aberrant beholders, which is pretty ironic, really, given like how many different variants there are in the rulebook. I mean, the beholder must be one of the creatures that has the most variants throughout like D&D. I mean, there's a ridiculous amount of them. And that's just in a couple of books we've looked at. I certainly know there's other books on our shelves that have got even more variants in. I know that back in the day of AD&D, they did when they were doing a load of supplements, they did one on mind flayers and they did one on beholders, which was all about their society and had numerous different variants and stuff like that. The book in question was called, appropriately enough, Tyrant, and it was one of the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Monstrous Arcana books, published for the second edition of AD&D in 1996. 93-page book, had loads of different illustrations of various different types of beholders, covered their society, what magic items they could use. There were psionics rules for them, and it generally expanded the race, and there were a lot of different variants included in it. And in fact, I'm pretty sure that the beholders even appeared in the old D&D like cartoon series. I'm sure they did.
Possibly. I don't remember. Been a while since we watched those
just
DVDs.
check on the internet. The internet will tell me.
Yeah, D&D cartoon in
there we go,
called Eye of the Beholder.
Which obviously, beauty in the eye of the beholder is a sort of classic phrase. I know I've not said it exactly right there, and obviously the computer game was called Eye of the Beholder, etc. But the actual monster itself is pretty unique to D&D, it looks like.
I mean, I've always thought of it as quite a Lovecraftian sort of a monster with all like the tentacles and the crazy sort of xenophobia, but...
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the sort of aberrations lean that way a little bit. I mean, like Eurylithids and stuff like that.
Well, yeah, they're all quite Lovecraftian, aren't they?
Yeah. They're the sort of slimy, tentacly monsters, aren't they? The aberrations. And before anyone like voicemails in to tell me, yes, I know that not all aberrations are slimy tentacle things, but let's face it, a lot of them are. Okay, so we've not managed to find, for obvious reasons, any sort of mythological antecedents to beholders because they were created for D&D. But one of the central facets of beholders, that of the power that emanates from their eyes and these special abilities they can do, petrification, anti-magic, stuff like that. There are a fair old amount of creatures in mythology that deliver their power or a curse through their gaze. So, for example, we've got like the Medusa. You know, if you look on the Medusa, it's not directly her gaze, but looking on the Medusa can turn you into stone.
The Basilisk, which is like a little green lizard with gold eyes. They're actually a real kind of lizard, and they do look amazing, and their eyes are really hypnotic. But they're also a sort of a mythological lizard monster that's anything from like the giant snake in Harry Potter to five-legged craziness in various different miniatures companies. Lots of different fantasy things have got a basilisk in there somewhere.
Yeah, and I'm sure there are more creatures out there that deliver their sort of power by
Cockatrice, I think, does as well.
Yeah. So, but in terms of how you use a beholder in a game, I think obviously the most obvious way of using them is they're the evil mastermind behind whatever's going on. I mean, we've got in 5th edition, we've got the book Xanathar's Guide to Everything, and Xanathar is like a beholder who, if I remember correctly, is like a sort of criminal mastermind in Waterdeep and has all these different agents and all these different plans going, because beholders are, since they're effectively just like giant floating brains with mouths and eyes, they're perceived as being very intelligent. But like you were saying when you were comparing them to the Daleks earlier on, all that intelligence, according to the rulebook, is bent to this sort of like xenophobic drive to prove themselves superior. So the sort of archetypal way of using them is as the evil mastermind. We've seen with the Death Tyrant, they could just be a servant who's been summoned by a necromancer or whatever.
See, I quite like the idea of having one as the sort of secondary villain.
Yeah.
Because they are very clearly going to be quite treacherous.
Oh, yeah.
So maybe there's a way that the heroes can like persuade the beholder to join with them to take down the bigger villain. But then, of course, you've got to deal with a beholder afterwards.
I tell you what I quite like there. That's a cool idea. I tell you what I quite like the idea of though, because if you have your sort of like your Death Tyrant with more of its own intelligence, as per the 5th edition one, I quite like the idea of like the reason the Death Tyrant is like doing whatever heinous acts it's doing is because it deliberately wants some adventurers to come and destroy it. Because
it hates being a Death Tyrant.
Yeah, because can you imagine if you were alive and you were like, yes, I am the ultimate in beholderness, this is what a beholder should be, and you rapidly destroy anything. Imagine then suddenly you find yourself turned into this like rotting skull-like thing. And yeah, okay, you might have the cool floating spectral eyes and the glowing red eye, but you're no longer that perfect thing you once thought you were. Now, the way beholders are portrayed in I, Tyrant, the supplement, is they really sort of like lock into stuff and they really can't shake this xenophobia. So I can imagine a beholder sort of hating itself so much of becoming undead, but not being able to actively take itself out, because that would be sort of admitting it to itself. However, if it does lots of evil stuff, it can trick itself into going, I'm doing this stuff because I want to do this like evil stuff and achieve all these goals. I'm definitely not doing it because they'll rouse up a posse of adventurers and come and take me out. So I think that could be a bit of an interesting spin on it. A sort of self-loathing beholder where its xenophobia has got to such a great extent that it now can't even stand itself. But also it can't admit its imperfections consciously, so it can't just terminate itself.
I do also think that it would take a very skilled GM to be able to get that across to most player groups.
Oh, yeah. It would be quite difficult to get that across. But I think it'd be a justification as well for, like, maybe it can't admit to itself that it wants to be, like, wiped out, but it's perhaps a justification as to why it doesn't bring all of its awesome power to bear against the heroes.
Yeah, fair.
And maybe, I don't know, maybe when you've taken it out, maybe you find some of its, like, memoirs or whatever. Or, I don't know what a beholder does for, like, memoirs. But maybe you find out that, like, this isn't the first party of adventures, and it deliberately seems to have done things that don't really benefit it, but that would provoke the most outrage from people. So, like, most beholders, like, go after stuff because it benefits them in some way. So maybe this death tyrant is like, I've just destroyed a village there. I've gained nothing from it, but it knows like if it destroys a few villages, a posse of heroes will turn up.
So you're saying it's basically a troll who's going to grief the server for attention.
Those are definitely words I've heard from you, young person.
So what else with beholders?
Okay, well, I think beholders in general, there's lots of different niches they can fill, because I know there's one which is, I forget what it's called. Hold on a second, let me just have a quick look in the monster manual. Yeah, so there's the Eye of the Deep, which is like a water-breathing beholder with less eyes and crab claws. And then there's the and the big tree one, I can't remember what it's called. The Overseer. Yeah. And it resembles like a fleshy tree, and it's normally it tends to be put as like a watch guard or something like that. So I think because they're so, despite being xenophobic, because they have so much variety in terms of their appearance, they're a really easy creature to fit into specific like niches, and everyone knows them as like a big sort of baddie from D&D.
True.
I mean, even if you've already played a few D&D computer games, you've heard of the Beholder. You know it's the big end of level thing with all the eyes and all the laser beams.
Now, see, while I'm aware of them, I don't think I've ever actually encountered one or used one in a game.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the point I was going to bring up. I don't think they're particularly commonly used. And I do wonder if that's just because of how lethal they are. So
they are dirty.
So I'm just like flicking through the AD&D Second Ed Monster Manual now, and looking here, you can see that like even for a basic beholder, it's like 14,000 XP to take one out, and that's the basic model beholder with no like extras that fitted at the factory. So let's have a look in 5th edition, see what the old challenge rating is for the basic beholder. Challenge rating 13, so you only get 10,000 XP for a beholder in basic beholder in 5th Ed D&D, but still challenge rating 13 on its Billy No mates. And if you fight a beholder, it's probably not going to be on its own. It's probably going to have some servants or agents. So they are very deadly creatures. And I wonder if that's why they don't tend to be used as much. I also think part of the issue with them is, like I say, they're often portrayed as very calculating, very intelligent. They often have like networks of agents, and portraying a sort of like a villain like that can be quite difficult, as you were saying earlier, because as we talked about investigation scenarios like a good few episodes ago now, it can be quite difficult to like leave those clues out and make sure everyone gets the clues and they sort of progress towards the situation. So if you have like a big beholder behind this network of evil agents and the player characters never get anywhere near him, you may as well not have had the beholder in the first place.
Yeah, that's true.
And I think it's very difficult to give a satisfying sort of game experience with that sort of thing. Now, if you do it right, and the player characters work their way up, and there's something like, aha, it's a beholder behind you, and they topple the big boss man, that's great. You'll get a real sense of achievement from that. But it's not an easy thing to do.
Yeah, so...
Conversely, if you just like plonk a beholder down like a normal monster, it loses a lot of its impact.
Indeed, it's one where it's got lots of powers, and if you don't use them all during a combat, then it's not gonna be as scary as it should.
Yeah, and like I say, because they're intelligent, if a beholder's been like Xanathar in like Waterdeep, it's been there for like God knows how many years, it's going to have encountered adventurers before. It will have countermeasures ready. But if you portray it 100% accurately, the player characters will have no chance against it. And that's not fun either. So if they're like, oh, we're going to go in and take this beholder out, and the beholder's like, oh, I levitate, I don't need to stand on the floor. So in fact, the whole floor of this room, which is my lair, apart from this like, central plinth where I've got my book on, it's an illusion over like a pit of lava or whatever. That's perfectly logical for a beholder to do, but it's not fun for the players as they run in and they're like, oh, we're going to get you, oh, we've fallen into lava and we've died. So again, it's the same with any sort of vastly intelligent and calculating enemy. It's like if you're trying to play like an NPC like an old vampire in like a World of Darkness game who's been around for like 500 years. They've got agents like they're going out of fashion. They've got resources. They've got everything. What chance does like a PC who's been around for like 12 sessions?
Yeah.
Even if in D&D you've slogged your way up to like 10th level or whatever, and you're like, oh, we're going to take on that beholder. In terms of the raw amount of time it's been around and the agents and power it could have garnered using its abilities, you're really not going to stand a great deal of chance against it.
Yeah.
So I think that's why they don't tend to get used very often. But as we've seen, there are a number of different varieties of them, and there are certainly some lower powered, less intelligent versions, which I think could be used quite easily. And I really love the idea of having a beholder as a big bad guy, but you've got to sort of work up to it. You've got to have like a long-term campaign going, and you've got to put that investment in to make sure you get the payoff at the end, and concoct some decent reason as to why the beholder's not just like, oh, let me enact contingency plan 37B and like just total the player characters immediately.
So, in conclusion, beholder's really distinctive D&D monster, really difficult to use well.
Yeah, exactly. They can be great. They've got a definite impact because everyone knows them, but as you say, they're very difficult to use effectively. And if you just throw one in as a monster and it's just like pew 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 and then they kill it, you've not got the best out of using a beholder, and the next time you bring one in, it's not going to have as much impact.
Yeah.
So that's been our episode on beholders. We hope you've got something out of that. If you'd like to leave us a message, perhaps telling us how you use beholders in your game, then you can leave us a voicemail using SpeakPipe. There's a link in the show notes, or you can send us an email to rddrpgpodcast@gmail.com. Until we see you next time, take care, stay safe, and keep gaming.
Bye.